Alhamdulillah wahda wa salatu wassalamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da. I'd like to begin by extending my thanks to the many people who made this event happen. Firstly, His Royal Highness Prince Turki. I'm most grateful to him for his personal endorsement of this event, as well as to my colleagues in the King Faisal Center. My name is Amar Anchasi. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. So I'd like to extend my thanks to my colleagues at the center, the Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Ibrahim Dughaythir, and also my colleague, Kumail Al-Ahmed. And I'm also very grateful that we're joined by our friends from Radboud University in the Netherlands, Professor Maaike van Berkel and her team of talented postdoctoral researchers. And I'm glad that they're here to share with us some of the fruits of their research. And I pray that this trip and the remainder of their trip continues to be a mutually beneficial one. I should briefly introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening. Professor Maaike van Berkel studied Arabic language and culture, as well as medieval European history, I should say, at the University of Amsterdam, completing her PhD in 2003. And she successfully won a number of prestigious research grants, and in recognition of her achievements, continued to be promoted through the ranks of academe until she was appointed in 2015. The title here is Chair of Medieval History at Radboud University, and I understand she was the first Arabist to occupy this distinguished position. The project she's speaking to us about today, from which she's drawing and to which our postdoctoral friends are attached, is funded by the NWO, the Dutch Research Council, and it's titled Source of Life, Water Management in the Premodern Middle East. Of course, today we're all interested in the question of sustainability. Our colleagues are focusing on the past, but I think they have a lot to say to us in our present condition. The project is now approximately at the halfway point. There are about 2 years left of it. So hopefully our colleagues will have many opportunities in future, perhaps at the King Faisal Center as well, to join us and to share their research and to strengthen research and interpersonal relations between both of our institutions and our countries. So without further ado, Maaike, she'll speak to us for around 40 to 45 minutes, and this will be followed by a period of question and answer, and then there'll be a reception at the end with drinks and snacks, so on, in the room just to our left there. So Maaike, please.
Thank you. متشكرين على استقبالكم جدا في هذا المركز. شكرا. I switch to the English now. I would like to thank the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies, first of all, for inviting us and being here. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very honored to be here. I would like to thank the embassy and the ambassador very much for this opportunity to have this collaboration on academic exchange with the King Faisal Center. So it's a great honor. I also would like to thank my research team for embarking on this project with me. They're all here, and we are very much enjoying our trip in Saudi Arabia, in the kingdom, and we are very happy to have a very welcome reception here. Our mission so far has been very exciting and inspiring, and we are looking forward to more collaboration with many people around here. I'm thankful to the audience for being here, for having interest in my lecture, and I hope I can live up to your expectations tonight. What I will present is a general introduction on our research project on pre-modern water management. Water is the essence of life, the source of life. And the Middle East is one of the regions in the world where managing access to clean water is particularly challenging. That's due to climatological and geographical circumstances, but it's in fact also a question of governance. And this is not just in the Middle East, but it is around the world a question of governance. One of the greatest challenges in the Middle East, water supply has been one of the greatest challenges in the Middle East in the past, and it sure will be in the future, and it is in the present. Nevertheless, in the past, the pre-modern era, societies were successful in providing water to highly populated cities, such as Abbasid Baghdad, and vital roads, such as the Darb Zubaydah here in the kingdom. In fact, the pre-modern Middle East sustained exceedingly large cities with up to 500,000 inhabitants, much larger than contemporary European towns. And these cities did succeed in organizing their water supply in one way or another. And scholars still do not fully understand how this was all organized, how this was achieved. So today I want to talk to you about the research project me and my team are working on, and it's called Source of Life, and it is about the water management in the pre-modern Middle East. We focused on the ways in which individuals, groups, institutions, and authorities organized water in cities such as Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, Basra, and many other cities. But we also studied their responsibilities along important roads, such as the pilgrimage road to Mecca, from Kufa to Mecca. Existing historical approaches have often suggested that the Middle East had weak institutions in comparison to pre-modern Europe. But this framing ignores the great success of institutions and infrastructures in the Middle East in supplying water to large populations under challenging circumstances. So our team investigates the multiple water systems that functioned in the pre-modern Middle East, and we analyze the sources of their sustainability. Water scarcity in the Middle East is, as in the rest of the world, I just said it, is not just a resource problem. It's not just a problem of geographical circumstances, challenges. It's for the better part also an issue of management. This is true for the past, and this is also true for the present and the future. And exactly this topic, the interrelationship between water and management, water and governance, is central in our historical approach. So although we will certainly try to map the water installations themselves, in the project we are mostly interested in the organization of water, the financing, the responsibility for the water supply. We ask ourselves the questions such as who took on these tasks, who built water installations, who financed them, who maintained them, or organized their maintenance. Who were the people involved? Were they public authorities, collectives, neighborhoods, individuals, communities, elites, rulers, private individuals? The organization of such an essential facility as clean water teaches us a lot about the way life was organized in cities in the pre-modern Middle East. It might also be an inspiration for how to organize water management in a sustainable way in the future. And I will come back to that towards the end of my lecture. But let's start with the past. On the left, we are looking at the 19th century photo of water carriers filling their water bags in the Nile close to Cairo. They walk into the water because the water right at the bank of the river is less clear and less clean. This is definitely an anachronistic image because it's a 19th century photo, but in our textual sources we come across a lot of water carriers throughout all cities in all pre-modern cities in the Middle East. Certainly, in the medieval period, rivers were some of the main sources of water, including water for drinking. And on the right, we see an image from a 13th century manuscript depicting a water-raising machine from Al-Jaziri's text of mechanical devices. It's driven by an animal, and it's one of my favorite images actually from this manuscript. For decades, historians have discussed the concept of Islamic city, an urban type that was considered to be essentially different from the European city. The history of institutions, and especially the history of urban institutions, has suffered a lot from a Eurocentric approach. This started with one of the founders of modern social scientists, the German historian and sociologist Max Weber, and his analysis of the city. And I don't want to be too negative about this great scholar Max Weber, but it's no secret among historians of the Middle East that his views on cities in the Middle East weren't the best, were not very profound. Mainly because he considers the non-European world in terms of what the West had and the rest supposedly lacked. This is specifically true what Max Weber says about the city and how these views have been inspired generations of scholars after him. The idea of the typical Islamic city, essentially different from a European city, was further nourished by Orientalist notions of a dichotomy, so an essential difference between East and West. So important elements in both Weber's definition of the city and the Orientalist notions of the Middle East were that there wasn't a presence of strong autonomous institutions in the East, in comparison to strong autonomous institutions in the West. According to Weber, the city in the Middle East was rather a mixture of densely populated residential areas without an organizational or an administrative framework. Weber attributed differences between the European and Middle Eastern city to differences in religion. Islam thus determined the most important characteristics of the city in the Middle East, according to Weber. And his analysis of, on the one hand, the European medieval city and its institutions, and on the other hand, the absence of these institutions in the rest of the world, formed an essential element in Weber's thesis on the development of economic rationality and modern capitalism in the West. And he used it to explain what he called the economic stagnation of the East. So the city, the specific Islamic city, according to Max Weber, was the origin of the stagnation of economy in the late medieval period in the East. Weber's thesis on institutional weakness has been criticized by many, but also still continues to inspire many historians, political and social scientists until today, and it's often mentioned as an argument for the rise of the West and the alleged stagnation of the East in the late medieval, early modern period. Criticism of this concept appeared most prominently in the 1960s with Ira Lapidus, second on the slide, Ira Lapidus' book, important book called Muslim Cities in the Later Middle Ages. Lapidus concentrated on the urban society and urban organization, and he still adhered to a dichotomy, so to an essential difference between Eastern and Western cities. But in contrast to previous generations of scholars, he argued that the Islamic city, or the Muslim city as he calls it, was not without structure and organization. However, whereas in Europe, according to Lapidus, there was a highly divided society which required formal agencies for the defense of special interests, in Muslim society life was less segmented and the organization of urban life was informal and fluid, according to Lapidus. More and different kind of criticisms on the concept of the Islamic city came in the 1980s and the 1990s. Authors such as Janet Aboulourot, André Raymond, Richard van Leeuwen, a Dutch colleague of mine, Nezar Al-Said, and others criticized the essentialist approach and the very small number of cities on which the research had been based so far, mainly North African cities, and they pleaded for more geographical and historical differentiation and context. There were also differences in their approaches. So while Aboulourot, for example, stuck to the idea of the influence of Islam on the city and its institutions, Al-Said and Raymond argued for a context based on regional differences. That is why Raymond and Al-Said speak about Arab cities instead of Islamic cities. And Raymond further played an important role in the rejection of the idea of the Islamic city as economically backward. He argued against it convincingly. Since then, few general studies on the concept of the Islamic city appeared. The few studies from area specialists, which do use a more comparative approach and deal with Islamic cities in general, often continue to stress the importance of Islam in the development of cities in this region. However, most historians of the Middle East don't focus on the concept as such, but on specific individual cities or specific urban institutions. Well, this long introduction on the historiography of cities in the Middle East has influenced the start of our project. Our project wants to reframe the narrative of Islamic institutional weakness. And we will do that by looking at the management of water supply in cities. So water for us is the lens through which we look at urban organization. So far, we have been able to demonstrate that multiple water systems functioned simultaneously, ranging from large-scale technological systems, such as aqueducts to public fountains, sustained by religious endowments, awqaf, and water carriers. Different systems required different forms of management and financing and served different customers. So far, there does not seem to be one answer to the question, who was organizing water? The patchwork of organizations, institutions, individuals, and state authorities involved seems to have been the rule rather than the exception. So the patchwork is the rule rather than the exception. And our hypothesis so far is that the hybridity of the system, so the patchwork of the system, was the source of its sustainability. A central system or policy would have been too vulnerable in times of crisis or turmoil. And I will get back to this sustainability of a hybrid system at the end of my talk, because I think there's also might be something for the future in that. The cities in the Middle East were large, certainly compared to cities in Europe in the early Middle Ages, but also compared to cities in Europe in the late Middle Ages. A city like Baghdad, built in the 8th century, grew into a cultural and economic center of the Middle East, a center for scholars, traders, and many others. Estimates of the city's population vary widely, from 250,000 to 2 million, with 500,000 being the most accepted estimate. But it's a huge city. The built-up area was about 5 times the size of Constantinople, one of the other very big cities at the time. The southern Iraqi city of Basra, a city that the Arabs founded shortly after the conquest of Iraq, probably had 250,000 inhabitants by the middle of the 8th century. Also in later centuries, cities in the Middle East were still huge. Cairo probably had 200 to 250 inhabitants in the middle of the 14th century, and was therefore at that time comparable to the biggest European city, Paris, who had approximately 200,000 inhabitants before the plague hit it. I do not know if we have reliable estimations of the population of Mecca in this era, and I'm happy to have your opinions on that. For such numbers of inhabitants, the water supply was a complicated matter. The same was true for the pilgrimage road and of course also for irrigation of agricultural lands. But the latter falls outside our research project. We focus on water supply for large numbers of people. Exploring the details of how this was achieved in cities in the Middle East is not an easy task. It requires the integration of both textual and material data of history and archaeology. Water history for the pre-modern Middle East is still a field in development. So far, most has been done by archaeologists, much more has been done by archaeologists than by historians, and mainly for the countryside and not for cities. A very important and relevant study for us and for the region here has been the study by Dr. Saad Al-Rashid, and he's sitting here in the front row, and I'm very honored he's here today. So he worked on the water installations along the Darb Zubaydah. In the remainder of my lecture, I will discuss some examples of water installations throughout the Middle East and focus on the management of these installations. But first, what was needed for a sustainable water supply? The 14th century North African historian Ibn Khaldun, I'm sure you know about him, talks about a good location. He's actually one of my favorite historians. He says, then there is the water problem. The place should be on a river. This is when he talks about how you can found a city. Or the place should be on a river, or springs with plenty of fresh water should be facing it. The existence of water near the place simplifies the water problem for the inhabitants, which is urgent. The existence of water will be a general convenience to them. However, the founder of a town sometimes fails to make a good natural selection, or he sees only to what seems most important to him or his people, and does not think of the need of others. The Arabs did that at the beginning of Islam, when they founded towns in Iraq and Ifriqiya. Among the cities were Al-Karawan, Al-Kufa, Al-Basra, Shijr-Majah, and the like. These cities were therefore very ready to fall into ruins, Ibn Khaldun says. Baghdad, on the contrary, is always praised in Arab sources for its perfect location. And here I'm not going to read out the whole quotation, but there's always an emphasis on Baghdad being on the junction of waterways, bringing goods from all over the world to the city. Contrary to Baghdad, Basra, further south, as Ibn Khaldun already is saying, is often described in the sources as a city with an unfortunate location. It's not just Ibn Khaldun who criticizes the location of Basra. We do not know why this location was chosen in the early Islamic period. Political and economic factors seems to have been strong enough to motivate people to move to Basra, and it developed into a huge city which seems to have housed 250 inhabitants. And I should say, for those who might not know, that Basra was not on the Shatt al-Arab, not where the modern Basra is, but it was some 20 kilometers inland. So that was the problem. That was where old Basra was situated. However, the lack of fresh water seems to have been one of the city's problems. And I have a nice poem on the water situation in Baghdad and Basra. It's by Abu Ishaq al-Sabia. Alas, I deeply miss Baghdad. I miss her snowy water. Here in ugly Basra, we are watered with only sickly, yellowish drinks. How could we be satisfied drinking it? While in our land, in Baghdad, we clean our behinds with purer water. I'm sorry, it's not my words. But it clearly shows the difference in the water situation. More contemporary sources also refer to the problems that Basra encountered in the first decades after its creation when organizing its water. Old Basra was, as I said, 15 kilometers from the river Shatt al-Arab, and the 9th century historian al-Baladuri describes in his Futuh al-Buldan how the first generation of inhabitants of Basra complained about the quality of their drinking water. While Muslim settlers in other areas had sweet water and luxurious gardens at their disposal, we here at Basra are in the salt marshes, bounded on the east by brackish water and on the west by the waterless desert. And they go on and on. The caliph and the governor reacted to these complaints by ordering the digging of a canal from the Shatt al-Arab to the city, and also from the Euphrates to the city. These important projects provided water for the city, but at the same time they were expensive and difficult to maintain. We hear a lot about redigging and reconstructions. Obviously, these are narratives containing sometimes entertaining stories, and they are also meant to praise the good governance by governor and caliph. However, if we are interested in how and by whom the water supply was organized, Al-Baladuri does provide us with some answers. He demonstrates that at least he and his contemporaries considered the organization of clean drinking water one of the obligations, one of the duties of the central authorities. So the provision of water was not exclusively a private matter. That's clear from at least his description. It was also a public duty. At the same time, the inhabitants of Basra did not always wait for the authorities to come up with a solution. Those who could afford it had a cistern built under their houses or in their gardens, in which they collected rainwater. Moreover, the digging of canals was not exclusively financed and organized by the governor. Private persons and private money formed an essential part of the managing of the canals as well. Members of the urban elite received land grants with the obligation to bring it under cultivation. Part of this cultivation was the digging of irrigation canals, and we hear from Al-Baladuri that these same irrigation canals were also used for drinking water. In other words, also many private individuals took part in the organization and financing of drinking water. Similar dialogue between public and private interests is apparent in water provision in Baghdad and Samarra. Much of the textual evidence relating to the succession of caliphal capitals emphasizes the role of the caliphs and members of the elite in the planning and construction of at least the major backbone of these cities, the hydraulic infrastructure. For Baghdad, the geographer Al-Yaqubi relates how during the initial stages of the construction of Al-Mansur's round city, wells and canals were dug to bring water to the building sites, not only to supply drinking water, but also for brick making and moisturing clay. Unfortunately, the layout of early Islamic Baghdad is not known through physical remains. And though textual sources describe the configuration of the canals that flowed through the city, details of the financing, construction, and management are rarely discussed. In one case, Ibn Sarabiyun mentions that a canal was dug by the Caliph al-Mu'tadid, suggesting continued elite oversight and investment in the water systems. It is notable, however, that his description of the canals often relates their route to the locations of various palaces, suggesting that providing water for these elite residences was often a primary goal. Similarly, Al-Harun al-Rashid, capital of Raqqa in Syria, also in Raqqa, significant hydraulic infrastructure was constructed, seemingly both as public good as well as for the caliph's own benefit. This can also be seen in Samarra, where the Caliph al-Mutawakkil embarked on the construction of a new city district along a large palatial complex to the north of the existing city. One of the key elements to this new development was a canal, the Nahr al-Jafari, that would bring water firstly to his new palace and secondly throughout the new districts he had planned. Construction began in 859 of the Common Era. And although ultimately the canal was never completed, work was ongoing for approximately 2 years at the cost of perhaps more than 1 million dinars. Involvement from the Caliph and his family is also very clear in the development of hydraulic systems for Mecca and on the pilgrimage road to Mecca. Again, we see here a blurring between state and private involvement, but in a slightly different way than the cases I discussed before. The water supply for Mecca was partly financed and organized as an act of charity by a woman, Princess Zubaydah, who was praised for her achievements by many contemporary historians. And I have an example of Al-Mas'udi, the 4th, 10th century historian. He tells us that when Caliph al-Qahir, who is a 4th, 10th century, early 4th, 10th century caliph, listened to the stories of his predecessors, and when his storyteller came to Harun al-Rashid and Zubaydah, this storyteller said, "The nobility and magnificence of this princess, Zubaydah, in serious matters as well as in light matters, have led her to be placed in the first ranks. Among her serious achievements, Zubaydah's charitable foundations, which are unprecedented in Islam, the drilling of the well called Ain al-Mashash in the Hijaz, must be mentioned. It was Zubaydah who had dug out the spring and caused it to flow, and with an aqueduct brought the water over hills and valleys, plains, mountains, and stony wastes, a distance of 12 miles to Mecca itself. It is estimated that these works cost no less than 1,700 dinars. I've already mentioned the public works, hospices, water tanks, and wells she founded in the Hijaz and at other frontiers of the empire, or at the frontiers of the empire. She devoted thousands of dinars to it without ever jeopardizing her other charities, and that was the help and kindness which she poured out on the needy. So the provision of water as charity is based on references from the Quran, Holy Quran, and Hadith. Water plays a prominent role, as you all know, in the Quran. It's mentioned 63 times as a noun, and in addition to mentioning of water, there are multiple references to rivers, seas, springs, and wells. In the Quran, water symbolizes creation itself. The Quran also instructs believers how to manage this natural resource. And tell them that the water is to be divided between them, each drink for each in turn. Offering water to the poor and needy and building public waterworks were important acts of charity from early Islam onwards. According to a well-known saying by the Prophet Muhammad, that is, in every thirsty living thing there is charity. In legal treatises, fiqh literature, Islamic jurists argue that water in its natural form is one of the resources man holds in common. It is for the benefit of mankind. It cannot be owned, and no person can sell it, rent it, or directly tax it. Drinking water for man and beast and water for domestic use take priority over agricultural needs. Hoarding of surplus water by individuals, even if all of the needs of the community are met, is forbidden. But collective storing of water in tanks and artificial lakes for future use of the community is allowed. But who then is responsible for organizing the water supply according to the legal texts? The 11th century scholar Al-Mawardi formulates the norms and says, rulers should pay for resources which are in the public interest from the state treasury. But they are only required to do so when the money is available in the treasury. And he continues, if the money is not available, the treasury is exempted from it. If this state of affairs would lead to public harm, it turns into a collective duty for all Muslims. An example of this collective duty is described by the 15th century Mamluk historian Al-Makrizi, who was for 3 short periods appointed as Muhtasib, Inspector of the Market or Inspector of the Public Place in the city of Cairo. With al-Makrisi's description of the water supply, we move from the legal theory on water to the practical application of the water laws. Al-Makrisi deals with the problems caused by the rise of the cost of drinking water. In the middle of the 14th century, people complained about these rising costs in Cairo, and the rising costs were due to the shifting of the Nile banks and the subsequent increase in transportation costs. Engineers decided that the construction of an embankment might be a solution to facilitate the collection of water from the Nile. According to al-Makrisi, the price of the construction had to be paid proportionally by those who owned land along this part of the Nile. And the Muhtasib was responsible for the organization and collection from the landowners. The inhabitants of Cairo are collectively responsible for the financing of the water supply, but it's the Muhtasib who initiates, controls, and oversees the process. It's the Muhtasib's responsibility to meet the needs of the inhabitants in the city. This Muhtasib, this market inspector, was also responsible for the control of the water carriers. In all Middle Eastern cities, as I said in the beginning, drinking water was often transported from the rivers directly to the houses in skin bags by water carriers or on beasts of burden. These water carriers provided an essential service which is similarly visible in many other medieval Islamic cities. The 9th century author, 3rd, 9th century author Al-Jahiz argues in his typical style that, let me see, it's here. Al-Jahiz argues in his typical style that he says, although the water carrier is the most honorable position a man can have, he has never seen any water carrier to be wealthy and prosperous. Unfortunately, he says, wealth is concentrated in the hands of those useless bureaucrats. Archaeological evidence from El Fustat, Cairo, gives us a more detailed understanding of how the water carriers may have operated. The houses that have been excavated at Fustat have niches located in entranceways with easy access from the street, and these corridors contained water jars, allowing water carriers to easily refill them or to top them up for the household water supply. These water carriers were not public employees, but commercial service providers who were presumably paid directly by the households and other users. Exactly how this service was arranged and how it operated in practice is a matter for speculation, or at least we haven't found enough detail so far. Perhaps water carriers were engaged to deliver water to a household at regular intervals or on specific days, presumably with the possibility to order extra deliveries if more water was required, for example, because of the presence of guests or festivities or special occasions, but we haven't found any references on that yet. A final water installation that I would like to talk to you about today is the Sabil, the public drinking water fountain. And we can still admire quite a few Sabils in cities throughout the Middle East. The oldest Sabil with the foundation inscription dates from the 5th, 11th century and is located in Damascus. Sabils were generally founded as waqf, as a religious endowment. Organizing water supply through the instrument of the waqf again shows an overlap between private and public investment. For the founders of a waqf, this instrument was a multifaceted and flexible instrument, serving both charitable and family purposes. And the waqf guaranteed the protection of one's property from confiscation, while the founders' descendants profited from its revenues as designated beneficiaries. But in addition, the establishment of a Waqf was also a charitable act to benefit certain public services, such as the water supply. And this work of piety provided a legitimization for the elite as well as care for one's soul. In a similar way, we are told by the 4th, 10th century geographer Al-Yaqubi that Zubaydah, Princess Zubaydah, founded a charitable endowment, a Waqf, for the upkeep of the water installations in and around Mecca. With Zubaydah and her investments in Mecca, I come to the end of my talk. The Waqf and its wide range of goals, applications, and intentions, both public and private, and the ways in which this institution contributed to urban water supply, shows us that it's difficult to make a difference between public and private investment in water management in the pre-modern era. I hope to have demonstrated that looking at both formal and informal organizations of water supply as both public and private institutions, at top-down and bottom-up initiatives, that this will help us better understand the water supply as a whole. It's a mixture of all those organizational forms. Secondly, by giving you a number of examples of water installations and the ways in which they were managed, I hope to have shown that water was not organized through a strong centralized system. Instead, we find multiple water systems which functioned simultaneously. These diverse systems were organized in various ways by the state, neighborhood communities, or individuals. And this organizational diversity seems to have been a source of the sustainability of the water supply as a whole. When one system went out of service, there was always an alternative system which did work. For example, the use of water carriers. And this might also be a bridge to present and future water management. This organizational diversity and the many community-based bottom-up forms of organization might be an inspiration for present-day water management. Some contemporary water projects in the Middle East, but also in the Netherlands, have shown interest in our project, especially for what it has to say about decentralized, community-based forms of organizing water supply. Exchanging knowledge with modern water managers about ways of organizing water on a more local, more decentralized, more community-based way in order to make people feel more responsible for their own water use might be inspiring for both historians and future water managers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please have a seat. Before opening the floor for questions, I should mention that in my absent-mindedness, I forgot to acknowledge the help and collaboration of our colleagues at the Dutch Embassy, particularly Petra Smulders in the organization of this talk. But I understand, to Excellency, the Dutch Ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would like to make a few remarks before we start. Sure, yes, please.
But I'm really very grateful to be here, and I'm very happy to have listened to a very interesting lecture by my good old friend, Professor Maaike van Berkel. Do you hear me well? Is it still, yeah? Whom we started the same study many, many years ago, and it's so interesting, and I just kind of realized it's the first time I hear you give a lecture. So this was really very exciting for me. I really want to leave it to the floor because I think it's a lecture that gives a lot of room for questions and answers, and I would be very eager to also hear from our Saudi friends, you know, whether there's still a muhtasab around, or whether there are still Waqf administrations that deal with water resource management and all the decision making on how to deal with scarce water resources. And so this is why we kind of set up and supported this lecture and the start of academic lecture, particularly in a very important year for us, because 2022 is really the year when we mark on the 150 years of having a diplomatic presence in the peninsula. And of course, we started in Jeddah and Mecca, facilitating the pilgrimage of people from the Netherlands in these. So we, at that time, were the biggest Islamic country. Well, of course, we changed that all in a more political correct way later. But I just wanted to say that the first time when I had my courtesy visit with His Royal Highness Prince Turki bin Faisal, and I visited the King Faisal Center, he also showed me all the books there were from Dutch lecturers, and that he was actually telling me, Janet, we have so much knowledge and relationship between our two kingdoms, whether it's from the past but also in the present, and we would very much stimulate to having that more exchange. And I'm really so very proud that we could start that in this year. And I'm really also very proud we do that in an area which is very close to our heart. If I look now at our current presence in the kingdom, it is all about supporting you in the implementation of Vision 2030, with a particular focus on circular economy, energy transition, but also water resource management. And all the companies that are here, they focus and they want to help you also to deal with the water and the sustainability issue. So everything that was being said, what was being done in the past, it also has a link to the present and the future. So, and I was also, having served in Iraq and also Syria, it's very, having visited Basra, the poem that you kind of recited, I think that's still very relevant. I think a lot of people in Basra, they feel the same way that it was cried by the poet. So I'm just really eager to hear from you, and I'm really want to say my thanks again to the King Faisal Center, but also the Heritage Commission to welcome this delegation. And I'm very also honored to meet with Dr. Saad Al-Rashid, and I hope that you will have some good questions for Professor van Berkel and her team. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I'd like to open the floor to questions and comments and reflections. We have a roving mic, so if you just indicate if you have a question, we can take the mic to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Doctor, for the informative lecture. My name is Naif. I believe in the 80s, the country had an ambitious goal to increase its food security, namely to grow a lot of crops inside the kingdom. And perhaps, that ambitious goal lacked adequate proper knowledge of all sides of the equation, because wheat, for example, consumes a lot of water. So as a byproduct of this plan, a huge part of the groundwater was depleted. Perhaps, a later thought would suggest that it would have been better to just import wheat and, save this precious resource. On the other end of the spectrum, where water frugality isn't the case, you see a lot of companies that even produce energy through crops. So between irrigation, desalination, and energy production, how could governments choose the right mix to deal with water?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I must say I'm not a water specialist. I'm a historian, and certainly not an advisor on these kind of topics. But I think that heritage can tell us a lot, and there's a wonderful water heritage in this country, and I think it can tell everyone a lot on how to deal with water. It's not just that I'm suggesting that we should revive all the old systems, because, well, that might sound a bit naive. In certain areas you can revive old systems, and I think especially in agriculture that might work, and there are some interesting examples for that. But I think it is what might help is people from a few generations, 2 generations ago, or still alive, of course, start to tell stories about how how expensive and how difficult it is to collect water, and that people become more aware that water is just not something which should be running from the tap endlessly, and that we all should be aware to use less water. And perhaps heritage, if heritage can work for that, that would be a very interesting, not solution, but interesting thing to add to it, to the problem, I think.
Thank you. Abdullah, I saw your hand. If we can bring the mic over to him.
so much for this fascinating lecture. Well, thanks so much for the fascinating lecture and very interesting topic, I'm sure. I mean, personally, I want to know more about it. But I had a couple of questions. You mentioned this is part of a project, so maybe some of the answer is coming later on. So there are two questions. One is, how does one compare these structures or institutions between different cities? I mean, do you look at the region as one block, or each city had its own diverse sets of systems, and and how do they compare to each other? And the other one is, are you in your research? Do you try to analyze what social structures had to exist to facilitate all the different processes to make these different services function? What kind of social relationships had to exist to facilitate A, cooperating with B, leading to water coming from next to Y? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Very, very interesting questions. The first one is, well, we started off ambitiously, thinking about doing 5-6 cities from the early Islamic era until the 15th century. And of course, during such a research project, you have to become more humble and say, okay, this is not really possible because we simply don't have the sources. But what we do is try to see chronological development as well, and that's where we start comparing, because in the early period, the first 4 centuries of Islam, not all of the water projects, but the majority of the larger public water projects like aqueducts and canals and seem to have been paid by the treasury, by the Bait al-Mal. In later periods, so in the example I gave for Mamluk Cairo, for example, there are different systems, and for example, the Waqf becomes very prominent in providing public services. So there seems to be a chronological development. That's one way in which we compare. And of course, then we compare in cases of, well, different cities with different locations, with whole different kind of structures and necessary organizations. We also compare differences between types of institutions. Of course, the maintenance of a qanat system is much more complicated than the maintenance of a water carrier, if you would call that a system. But still, it is comparable in a way. So yeah, we do make a lot of comparisons chronologically, geographically, but it's the sources, the textual as well as the archaeological sources are of course limited, and you're never able to do like a full comparison because for Baghdad you have no archaeological remains water related so far because it's been built over, of course, many times. For Samarra we have a wonderful archaeological remains, and so there are differences, of course. And your second question, now I lost it, was on...
It was about the social system.
Yes. Yeah, we do study them. One of the beautiful examples, yeah, maybe Angela wants to answer it. No, you don't want to. I can answer it. Because Angela, the PhD student in our project, is studying, for example, what we call a Waqf community. So all the people involved, so the complete social structure around the Waqf. It's not just the Waqf, it's not just his family members who manage the Waqf, but it's all people working there, getting a salary from the Waqf, people profiting from the Waqf, people working on the lands which provide the Waqf, and they all together form what we call Waqf community, and it's a very interesting structure in how all these people work together on a specific endowment. Yeah. So that's one example, but yeah.
Excellent. Other questions, comments, or remarks? Professor Al-Rashid?
Can I go ahead?
Yes, that should be all right.
I'm very delighted to be with you tonight. And then very happy that you made your trip to Saudi Arabia at last, and I wish you a very fruitful trip with plenty of knowledge about water installation in the areas that you are going to visit with the company of my colleagues. It's a very important topic, really, and it needs a continuous work with the collaboration of the institutes here in Saudi Arabia, not on archaeological and architectural matter, but also on how to reuse the older installations for the future use. And I'm not going to raise a lot of points, only quite a few. As you mentioned, that water is the source of life. In the Quran, وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ. We made everything alive from water. And also on the economizing water, rationing water. It's one of the teachings of Islam. And we were brought up to respect this until now, and I hope in the future. And Prophet Muhammad, once he saw a guy taking wudu, the ritual cleaning, and he said, stop doing this, and you have to be aware of how to use water, even if you are taking water from a running river. So to that extent. You mentioned early Islamic towns, capitals like Baghdad, Basra, Kufa, Fustat, and other cities. And you quoted Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun, when he deserted Yemen, he went to lovely places, nice places with rivers, lakes, and active people and so on. He used the luxury. So it's good in certain points we believe on, but come to Arabia, which considered to be a desert area. It's people are migrating from Arabia and so on, and when we believe in certain dialogues and so on, but nonetheless, Arabia was highly populated. And historians and geographers concentrated on the new lands, the new birth of cities in Iraq, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, Cairo, and so on, and Spain. And they neglected Arabia. Only they took on minor topics like geographers who wrote about the roads, because if not only because it reached to Mecca, but also to count whereabout they can get the alms tax from the inhabitants, as zakah. But we don't have much literary resources on the cultural, on the architecture. The fall of Baghdad under the Mongols, and the war and the Crusades, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and so on. And still Arabia was unknown until even the early European pioneers like Hogorneau and Huber, Mosels later on, and so on, Burton and so on. But still Arabia was not in the picture of the historians and so on. Even in the documentary reports of for military use, voted by the Royal Naval on the Red Sea, on the Gulf, and so on. So they extracted information from the written sources of the European explorers and so on. So they pinpointed where are, if they want in the desert, where to get water from, and so on. But if you look at Central Arabia, in Najd, we call it Najd, which is the old Yamama. It was flourished because of water with no rivers. Because the ancient wells in Arabia played a great role of the settlements. And sometimes one well can feed a big village or a big town. And that's why when during the birth of the first Saudi state, we had hundreds of villages, hundreds of towns still exist, despite the speed modern life we are enjoying, but there are hundreds of villages still exist. They lived, I mean, they created their own way of life, building beautiful houses with streets, with their narrow roads and so on, and they dug wells and also water canals and dams, and it still exists. We have examples like, I mean, I hope one day you come and you had a longer period staying in Saudi Arabia and you do surveying and you get in touch with institutions to get the literary sources, and I'm sure you will collect ample information. And you can set an example, study an example of how can you recreate and to make the use of the older water installations come alive again. And it's very easy. It's very easy.
Is the knowledge still available among people in the villages?
Yes.
How to deal with the older
Until
systems?
now. We have examples. If you take them to Ushaiqir, he's south of Riyadh, it's amazing. If you go to Dar'iyah itself, Dar'iyah one of the largest late Islamic capital, not far away from Riyadh. It's because of the strategic place and also of Wadi Hanifa. And I tell you also an example that Wadi Hanifa is 180 kilometers from northwest of Riyadh to southwest. They used to transfer the news by mouth from one village to the other. When they say, for example, tomorrow is our Eid, Ramadan festival, they say, okay, by mouth until it reach to the south, because villages were built on the banks of the Wadi Hanifa. And also, you mentioned some sources, but I'm sure you know the treatise of Al-Karafi, استنباط المياه الخفية. This tradition was still in use until today here in Central Arabia. So as for Waqf, I think the good example, I'll finish my a good example was set by King Abdulaziz. When King Abdulaziz unified, succeed with the people, they complete the unification of the kingdom. You mentioned Mecca. So Mecca was suffering. So he initiated establishment Al-Ain Al-Aziziyya. And they used the aqueduct of Darb Jubaydah, and he dragged water from Wadi Fatima. Wadi Fatima, north of Mecca, and they had hundreds of wells, spring wells, running over the ground. I remember Wadi Fatima when I was young. I was in my primary school. It was green and so on and so on. Before of the use of the artesian wells. Very dangerous, horrible, really. Wadi Fatima was paradise. So the community, they dedicated some spring wells as a waqf to feed water to Mecca and Jeddah. Jeddah has no river. Poor Jeddah, they have, they have storages and also few wells inside the town and a desalination plant. But it was on railway state. They were starving, so he dragged water with the help of the people of Wadi Fatima until it reached. It was a joyful day when the water reached Jeddah. So anyway, I have a lot of points. I hope in the future I'll be under your disposal for your task and the university, and also your partners. I hope King Faisal Foundation and the High Commission for Culture. Also, they have a lot of information about the preliminary comprehensive archaeological survey in Saudi Arabia. It started from late 60s until now. So they have ample information, they have photographs, they have plans and so on. And just if you make an experiment on one of the sites, how to reuse the water and also the dams. One final word. In Khaybar, we have the largest early Islamic water dam. They called Sadd al-Bint in Khaybar. It was 300 meters in length and 30 meters in height. 2/3 of the dam is still in situ. My point is that if you study the lake that was created by the water dam, how long the sediments took, so you can know the age, the stratification, and how can we make, it's like, Marib Dam, the Emirates, they built a new dam, not far away, but very useful, so we can do the same here in Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We have just a few minutes, perhaps time for one or two comments or questions, if anyone would like to add any further remarks. So I actually have one reference. So when I was looking at your slides before the lecture, because you mentioned Quranic references to water and the place of water, and I was reminded of one particular verse. Where is it? Where Pharaoh says, قال يا قوم أليس لي ملك مصر وهذه الأنهار تجري من تحتي. And in the Quran commentary of Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi, he has very interesting remarks on this verse. And he says, in reference to the Anhar flowing under Pharaoh's palace, what have you, he says these are the tributaries, or maybe even canals. He uses the word Anhur, which is a bit ambiguous, as we've seen. These are the tributaries or canals flowing from the Nile. There are 4 major ones: Nahr al-Malik, Nahr Tulun, Nahr Dimyat, and Nahr Tanis. I'm not sure if these are references to tributaries or canals. Perhaps some of our colleagues know. He said, it is said that they used to flow under his palace. He appealed to the vastness of his wealth, Mal, and the loftiness of his station, Jah, to demonstrate his preeminence. So in the Quran itself, Pharaoh is appealing to the ability to, channel water, if you like, to his palaces, as a demonstration of his sort of power and superlative wealth, and so on. So I thought that was a nice way to tie it in into the Quran.
It's a beautiful reference. If you can
Send
send it to me.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perhaps we have time for one final comment or question. Abdullah, please. Please.
I forgot to ask in the beginning, the first slide you had, there was an image of some kind of water system. Does your research include the technologies that were used and the transfer of knowledge between different cities and different eras?
Yeah, also a very, very interesting question. Yes, when we can, and I'm thinking now of Peter. Help me. Did we help me? Didn't we come across this example in Samarra? I think where people were hired for the installation with technical knowledge. Weren't there like engineers hired for this particular? Yeah, both are nodding, so I need to rely on their research. So yes, sometimes, of course, we're very interested in finding out how and when and who had the knowledge and how people were hired, for example, and whether enslaved people or people higher up in the hierarchy were hired for certain big water projects. But we find so far bits and pieces of information. But yeah, engineer co-work. Yes, exactly. Because I think this example is where people came from another place, right? Do you remember where they came from when they came to Samarra?
It doesn't always explicitly say so, but it does mention that for the construction of Samarra, people are brought in from all over, engineers and specifically water engineers.
Recruited, skillful people.
Yes. So skillful people, and then the workers doing the digging, and so it's yeah. So, but it's bits and pieces of information we find. That's.
The manuscript you had in the beginning. I mean, were authors writing about these technologies?
Yes, very much so. Yeah. That's fascinating. Yeah.
Okay, please join me in thanking Professor Van Berkel for her wonderful talk, and thank you.